I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the continuing fallout from the possibility of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's being indicted by Israel's Attorney General on 3 criminal corruption charges involving bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And as is pointed out everywhere, if there actually is an indictment, and it should be stressed, there has not yet been any indictment. It could take months for an indictment to actually be processed. But if there is an indictment, this would be the first time a sitting prime minister would be indicted in Israeli history. But in life, especially in political life, there's always a distinction between the letter of the law and the political reality that's expressed through the will of public opinion. And public opinion can be the most powerful force in the world for good and for ill. So how might the legal charges swirling around Mr. Netanyahu affect the upcoming Israeli elections in April? And how are American Jewish leaders reacting to the possible indictment of a prime minister, in this case, Mr. Netanyahu? For some answers, I'm so pleased to be joined from Washington, D.C. by one of world Jewry's leading veteran journalists, Ron Kampeas, the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Ron, thanks so much for being with us once again on JBS.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ron, what are you hearing from Jewish leaders in Washington, and for that matter throughout the Jewish community, in response to what seems to be serious charges leveled against the Prime Minister?
They're holding their fire for now because, as you said, the indictment has come down, or the recommendation for indictment has come down, but there's no indictment yet. I think they want to leave this up to the Israeli voters. I mean, you saw what happened, how they walked the line in a completely separate issue, the kind of very complex talks that he used to get Otzma, the far right-wing party, to get into a union with Beit Yehudi, a Jewish home, in order so the right could shore up its power. So there's a lot of concern here about Otzma and its background and the roots of its leaders and Kach and followers of Meir Kahane, etc. But the condemnations were very carefully phrased, not to mention Netanyahu, because he's the prime. And so I would think that the same thinking would go into the whole recommendation for indictment issue. He's the prime minister. He's the leader of the state of Israel. He's going to be coming to speak at AIPAC on March 24th or 25th, whatever his speech is. He'll be meeting with President Trump, I'm sure, during that time. It hasn't been confirmed, but that would be a natural. And so I don't think that Jewish leaders, Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, wants to get in the way of that, in his capacity as Prime Minister of Israel.
At the same time, Ron, is anyone speculating on how the Attorney General's announcement that he intends to indict Mr. Netanyahu, how that will affect Israel's upcoming elections in April? Does it, are people now speculating, doesn't matter, Netanyahu will still win? Does the people say, well, he can't win now?
No, yeah, people are closely watching. The Jewish community leaders are very closely watching the polls, even though it's early days in Israel. 6 weeks is a long time for an election everywhere. Even though it takes like a year and a half to have an election here in the States, 6 weeks would be a long time to predict an election. But particularly in Israel, because things are just getting underway, I think people are noting that Kahol Lavan, blue and white, Benny Gantz's party, is doing very well in the polls, but also that even although it's doing much better than the Likud party in the polls, it doesn't yet have the coalition to keep Netanyahu from winning a 5th term, because it's in a parliamentary democracy, you have natural allies, whether you're in the right, the center, or the left, and it looks like Netanyahu still has the edge in terms of getting together with those parties and putting together a government. So what does this do? I mean, what's going to happen over the next few weeks is that reporters there are going to be pouring through the 57-page indictment and picking out claims about the various allegations of corruption and bribery, and calling up people and trying to get more details. And that could, adversely affect Netanyahu. On the other hand, maybe it won't. He has a very loyal and a very strong base. He has a good record of keeping the country safe since in his current iteration since 2009. There hasn't been an intifada, and the 3 wars that he's had to handle, well, the first war wasn't even really on his watch. So the 2 wars that he's had to handle from Hamas in the Gaza Strip have been well handled. He's very good at pursuing a war, prosecuting a war, but also showing restraint and not letting it get out of hand. And so, the Israelis know that, they trust him, and they appreciate that quiet and the fact that the economy has been able to grow under those circumstances.
Okay, you've said a lot of important things. I want to try to break them down for our audience. Let's begin with the first one, a very important insight that you're trying to share with us. American Jews must understand that there's a parliamentary government in Israel, and to lead the government, to be the one who governs, it's necessary to put together a majority of 61 or more seats in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And what you're saying is that it is possible that blue and white party, this new party with Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, that it could win more seats in the Knesset than Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu. But that winning more seats for yourself, if you win 20 seats, 25 seats, 30 seats, the real question is not how many seats do you win, but how many seats can you gather together from your own party and any other parties that join you in a coalition to allow you to govern. What you're suggesting is, even if blue and white were to win right now more absolute seats than Likud, it would be Netanyahu has a better chance of putting together a coalition of 61 or more seats than blue and white. Do I have it correct?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, Gantz basically has to win over what I've read is a core of maybe 200,000-300,000 voters who are not right-wing, who vote for Netanyahu because they see him as stability. He has to bring those voters over to his side, and then if he does that, if he succeeds in doing that, he could form the government.
Okay. It's interesting to me that you then stressed that one of the reasons why Netanyahu has repeatedly been, in essence, elected in a way that he is the one who can form the coalition government is that the Israeli people feel he has kept them safe. Also, as you point out, the economy is doing well, and many people are very pleased with the diplomatic achievements he's had, opening up relations with countries that up until now have not had relationships with Israel, including some of the Arab Emirate states. But that I hear this over and over again. The main strength that Netanyahu has is people believe he will keep Israel's strength, strong and protected. The new party, Blue and White, is led by a former Israeli chief of staff, Benny Gantz, and it has 2 other former chiefs of staff as key members of the party in the top 5, together with Lapid. To what extent is that party, is Blue and White, trying to present itself as a party which in fact could protect the Israeli people at least as well as Netanyahu, or perhaps even better?
Oh, they're definitely advancing that idea. I mean, particularly Benny Gantz. Part of the biography that he emphasizes is that he helmed the military during the 2014 Gaza war. In a way, both he and Netanyahu can put that in their plus column because it stopped the terrorism coming out of the Gaza Strip. It put an end to the rocket barrage coming out of the Gaza Strip, and Israel recovered very well. So they both can claim a plus from that. But additionally, I think he's also as soon as the indictments or the recommended indictments came down, Gantz's statement emphasized how destabilizing it would be to have an indicted prime minister to Israel. In other words, he didn't necessarily go for what the Labour Party, for instance, went for, which is to attack Netanyahu as corrupt and even criminal. He said that I know that you care about Israel because I've worked with you, and I think that you really love Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and I know that you understand how dangerous it is for Israel to have an indicted prime minister. So even in that subtle sense, Gantz is kind of trying to claim the security, the safety high ground.
All right. I've heard, Ron, that one of the problems with Gantz's blue and white party with Lapid is that they have not advanced a platform of their own, that their platform is basically vote against Benjamin Netanyahu. It's reminiscent in some ways of what we hear in America, anybody but Trump. But if it's Trump, you hate him. And I want your sense, to when you talk to, again, people in Washington, Jewish leadership, as you watch yourself, is it your sense that there is a problem in that blue and white has not yet developed its own positive agenda?
I'd imagine that there would be a problem for the voters in Israel. They want something that they can grab onto. I don't think there's a problem here for the Jewish leadership because when as you described it, the problem that Gantz and Ya'alon and Ashkenazi and Lapid have is that they're kind of Netanyahu light in terms of foreign policy and, of course, and security policy, and of course that's what preoccupies the American Jewish leadership. So they're confident that they're going to also put up a strong front on Iran. They're confident that they're going to be robust in terms of protecting Israel's interests. I presume, I think there's the presumption, although it's not based on much because they really don't talk about the Palestinians, this blue and white party, but there's a presumption that they might be more open to a peace process, but that's besides the point now because the peace process, despite the best efforts of the Trump administration, of Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, the peace process is moribund because the Palestinians won't come to the table. So even that issue, which in other circumstances it might have played a role where American Jews always feel a little more comfortable with the party that wants to pursue peace because it takes a lot of pressure off them in terms of advocating for Israel. But that's not even an issue here because there's a kind of recognition that it's moribund and that really the Palestinians are at fault. That's the consensus.
Very interesting. By the way, how do you think, we're going to get back to Netanyahu in a moment, but how do you think blue and white self-defines itself? What you said was that ultimately the question is going to be who can put together a coalition on the right, because the right has, in general, more overall seats than the left. The question is, therefore, for me, how does blue and white self-define itself in terms of left and right?
Oh, they're very much a centrist party. I mean, they back the
right
out of the Iran deal. They back there is a distinction. I think that Netanyahu, having once contemplated removing, let's say, the settlements that are considered illegal even under Israeli law, is now saying he won't even do that. I think Gantz has said that's one of the definitive things he said, that he would remove the so-called illegal outposts. I don't know if he's actually gone so far as he would, whether he would remove settlements that are beyond the security barrier, but he said he would definitely remove the illegal outposts, and that's consistent certainly with people who've served high up in the military. They see the outposts as an affront. So that's one subtle difference there, but otherwise they are all for protecting every Israeli, whether they're in the West Bank or whether they're within the 1967 lines.
Okay, but your point is that in some way they are not associated with parties on the right. And it seems to me that given the overall makeup of the Israeli parliament in general, when all the votes are in, ultimately it will be easier for a party leaning right to form a coalition government than it would be for even a centrist party, or certainly one on the left, that would make it harder for blue and white, even if it was able to win more seats than Likud, correct?
Yeah, I think at this point in history, yes. If there was a viable peace process, if there was a Palestinian leadership that showed the kind of courage you need to get a peace process going forward, and if there was a Bill Clinton type president that was interested in advancing a peace process, that was dedicated to that, and that had a viable plan going forward, that would shift, I think. I don't think that Israelis are inherently attached to the West Bank settlement overall, not in terms of majorities. But right now, they don't see any of that happening. So it's that certainly tips the scales in favor of the right.
And one last point in this area. Because there is no peace process at the moment, and it's because the Palestinians obviously have shut it down. And Ron, you and I have been watching this, forever? And sadly, it seems as if the Palestinian world is still gripped by a philosophy that says from the river to the sea. Once you say from the river to the sea, you have precluded any accommodation, two-state solution, living side by side. So at the moment, there's a sense in the state of Israel that tragically, sadly and tragically, there's no peace partner at the moment. Once the Israeli electorate took that view, what people have said to me is it moved to the right, so that the Israeli center now is where you're describing. It's not that the Israeli people have turned rightist, but that sadly history has forced the entire community, the entire populace, to move in such a way that now what it means to be a centrist is, yes, I want a two-state solution, but I'm not going to have a two-state solution with people who want to kill me. And people who represent that, Netanyahu and other what were normally called right-wing parties, are representing more of what we would define as the Israeli center, as would have been true in the past. I want to know the extent to which you're comfortable with that analysis.
I think that's true to an extent. I think what's also true is that structurally, I think that the fact that you have one authority in the West Bank among Palestinians and another in Gaza Strip, and that they kind of hate each other, is also very damaging to the prospects. It's just, I mean, there's been talk, there's been analysis over the years, certainly that the Palestinian Authority is capable of retreating from the river to the sea formula. You saw a lot of that, I think, in the first months of the Trump administration, when there was a genuine belief on the part of the Palestinian Authority Palestinians that Trump really did have a viable peace plan that he was going to advance, and that it would come out with a two-state solution. You had to retreat away from that rhetoric. And there's even been analysis that maybe Hamas would retreat from that rhetoric under their certain circumstances in the Gaza Strip. But it doesn't matter, because these guys can't get together. So structurally, I think that the Israelis realize, we've got a very weak Palestinian leadership, ineffectual in the West Bank. We've got a very hostile river to the sea, as you put it, genocidal even, Palestinian leadership in the Gaza Strip. They can't work it out. Meanwhile, we've got to go on living, and this party, Netanyahu, has done a pretty good job of advancing at least that.
I understand.
And you pointed out something I've said before, I'd forgotten. He has scored diplomatic advances in terms of building up Israel. He's shown that you don't need an active peace process to bring Israel's message to all parts of the world, and that in turn also has had a good effect on the economy, although I don't think it's the only factor, but certainly opening up markets in Africa, that kind of thing.
Yes. When I speak with Israelis, very often they say something to me that goes like this: we don't like Netanyahu, but he's the best guy on the block. There's nobody else. And therefore, until there is somebody else, even if we don't like him, he's done enough good, and he's certainly strong enough. And so, although we don't like him, we're going to ultimately want him to be the prime minister. Have you heard that kind of argument as well?
Absolutely. I mean, it's taken on even in a kind of a perverse sense that when that when the corruption charges and the reports of corruption do start dominating headlines and conversations in Israel, when I've been there, I've spoken to Israelis, they tend to blame it on his wife, which is it's not fair to his wife, because I think they're a couple. They make decisions together. Yeah. But it just shows that the reflex among Israelis are, okay, these things bother us, but we're going to blame this on this other person. We don't want to attach it to Netanyahu, because we need to think of him as being the leader of the country. So yeah, for sure, yes. You have that.
Yeah, even if we don't like him, he is our leader, correct?
Right.
And you said a moment ago that that Benny Gantz took this position, Bibi, I know you love Israel, but it would not be good for a prime minister under this cloud to be prime minister. In general, do Israelis believe that Benjamin Netanyahu loves Israel?
I think they do. I mean, I think that, it's more complex when you're looking at from inside the forest, when you're living in Israel, yes, as to what it means to love Israel. But I think for sure that they realize that that he comes out of a tradition of, a strong Zionist tradition, that he adored his late father and really thought that his father had, and his father was dedicated to the idea of Israel for sure. And that he's not an opportunist, not entirely an opportunist. That he's done things that they see as opportunistic for sure, but that's not what brought him into politics, and that's not what made him want to be prime minister.
Very well said.
And so, yeah.
Okay, so we're seeing an American president also under a certain sense of political attack, and Alan Dershowitz has said he may be representing Mr. Netanyahu, and Dershowitz's perspective is that the situation, similar to the one surrounding President Trump, is an example of political opponents weaponizing the law for partisan political purposes. And the truth is, Mr. Netanyahu has responded rather forcefully with his side of the story, and he refutes the seriousness of the charges against him one by one. There are 3 charges, and he has an answer for all 3. Now, I'm not in a position here to evaluate the strength of Mr. Netanyahu's arguments, but it is important, it seems to me, to make sure the audience understands. The Prime Minister is arguing that he has done nothing wrong. He honestly feels he has done nothing wrong. At least that's the way he presents it. And I'm wondering whether there are Israelis who also sort of see it from the same way. Again, Israelis understand the extent to which there is corruption throughout politics, all throughout the world, and certainly there have been corruption in Israeli politics, but that the extent to which there is an attempt to indict a sitting prime minister, there are Israelis who have serious concerns about it, a la the arguments made by Mr. Dershowitz. And the question I'm asking you is, again, as you're plugged into what American Jewish leadership is saying, whether it's in Washington, or you're hearing it through AIPAC, or you're hearing it through the AJC, the people you ultimately are always trying to understand what's the American Jewish perspective. To what extent is that argument accepted, namely that there is something of a political nature here, and that the Prime Minister certainly has the right to offer his explanation, his answers in a legal context before an indictment actually goes through?
Well, I think he certainly has the right. He has a great platform. I mean, he gets massive amounts of attention, and he pushes back. I don't know to what degree. I mean, anybody but his most loyal followers believe in Israel that he's being singled out or persecuted because of who he is. This is a country that has a very robust tradition of prosecuting leaders who have gone awry. The things that he's been accused of are far more serious, let's say, than the thing that brought down Yitzhak Rabin in 1975 or 6, when it was discovered that he'd had some overseas accounts here up totaling no more than $10,000, which was at the time illegal. that and the extent of the corruption that and bribery that Netanyahu is accused of is far more pervasive than that. Ehud Olmert went to jail for double dealing and taking bribes. The prime minister who was prime minister until 2009, and he's on one side, and then the other issues that everybody knows, including here in the Jewish establishment, people know who Mandelblit, the Attorney General, is. He is somebody who served loyally as Netanyahu's cabinet secretary for, I think, 5 years, and who has pursued this very cautiously. So it's kind of difficult to square that with the idea that politics are being weaponized against him.
Okay, very well said. We only have a minute or so left. As you look at the way in which American Jewry is in some way, caught in a vice. The whole attitude we've had is that whether it's AIPAC or other major Jewish organizations, we respect the Israeli people, the democratic process that the Israeli people live with, and that ultimately our job is not to govern Israel. We can have feelings, but ultimately we have a respect for what the Israeli people are doing and the decisions they make. At the same time, you've pointed out, this is a very serious series of charges against the sitting prime minister who's about to enter elections and may win an unprecedented fifth term. To what extent do you feel that American Jewish leadership is sort of lost right now? To what extent do you feel they understand where they're going and they have a sort of a coherent philosophy of what their position should be vis-a-vis the state of Israel, the Israeli people, the democratic process of Israel?
I think that lost is a good way to put it, because right now Israel is in such flux. And yes, absolutely, the traditional reflexive tendency of the American Jewish establishment is to look to Israel, take its lead on at least on national security and foreign policy issues, because it is a country that's autonomous and has a democracy and is answerable to its voters. And right now, they see instead a country that is in kind of chaos because of these recommended indictments and the allegations, and they're just wanting to wait it out. I think there's going to be a lot of relief if we get a clear outcome on April 10th, the day after the elections.
Absolutely. Ron, it's just always a joy to speak to you. I appreciate the insight. I appreciate the balance. As we begin 2019 together, I hope this is a wonderful year for you and that we get to speak often. But I thank you so much for always making yourself available to me. You're doing fabulous work.
Okay, thanks so much, Mark.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
The thoughts of Ron Kampeas, who again is the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, Editor, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.